It passes a lot of states really quickly. It actually passes in Hawaii state legislature on the same day, with the time change helping out with that effort. But they get close to the number of states they need within a couple of years. What feminists, especially now, did not anticipate was the emergence of an organized anti-feminist movement of women who were really galvanized by not only Roe versus Wade and the ERA's momentum, but the rise of a group like Now that was broadly appealing, that argued that gender equality was not threatening to anyone, that it's just sort of a natural extension of democracy and of, the forward march to progress we should take as a nation. So this grassroots movement of anti-feminists, who are certainly aided and abetted by corporations and economic interests that don't want to see the ERA pass, they come together and start to push back and say, no, this ERA is not a benign affirmation of values we all share. It's dangerous. It's dangerous for American families. Men and women are not the same. They're not equal, and women will only suffer if they're forced to make equal sacrifices to what men make. So this is the heat of the Vietnam War. Actually, it's sort of towards the end at this point, but wildly unpopular war by the end of it that saw a lot of senseless American death. And the draft, right? This becomes a real issue that the ERA's opponents latch onto, is that, women would have to be drafted. If they had equal rights, they would have to make equal sacrifices. And who wants their daughter to be drafted? So Now is kind of working on the ERA as one of its many priorities in the early 1970s. They're organizing a little bit in some of the states where it hasn't been ratified yet, but they're not too concerned. But then once the ratifications start to slow down around 1974, 75, they've still got a handful of states to go. And they look at the map and see the states that are the most conservative, where groups like Now have the least infrastructure, are exactly the places where they're going to have to go to try to get this across the finish line. And so in that mid-70s moment, Now's leaders they change course. They decide that, look, we're either going to have to let the ERA go, or we're going to have to really double down and give up our kind of grassroots, freewheeling, diverse, multifocal network of women and make a much more focused push to pass the ERA, to get it through these last couple of states that we need. And so that's what they do. They set up a new national headquarters in Washington, D.C. They embrace new fundraising techniques and bring in a ton more money, millions of dollars, which is pretty much unthinkable before this time. And they set up a sophisticated lobbying and protesting organization they target 5 different states. And so Now really becomes, if not the leading vehicle pushing for the ERA, certainly one of a handful of the most prominent groups advocating for the ERA. And they raise a lot of money. They raise a lot of consciousness. They get a lot of people out in the streets. The ERA is broadly supported by the American public. I think it's 80% of Americans are in support of the ERA in the late 70s, which I think actually pretty closely mirrors the proportion of Americans who support it today. But it wasn't enough. And the ERA, they did win an extension on that deadline from 1979 to 1982. But the ERA expired in 1982, 3 states short of ratification. And I would say that's currently where it stands, but that's not true. More states have since ratified it. But the big outstanding questions related to the ERA have to do with the constitutionality of that time limit and the constitutionality of the ratifications that have come since. So there's a lot of energy and debate around the ERA now, and there's a lot of ambiguity in where it stands. Obviously, we should have it, but we'll see if we get it.
You talked about groups, anti-feminist groups that arose in response to Now, and if I'm remembering correctly, Jean Kirkpatrick was certainly one of the figures. Are you thinking
of Phyllis Schlafly? She was the most visible.
I am thinking of Phyllis Schlafly. Thank you so much for correcting me. And there were groups around figures like that through the 1980s and certainly through to the 1990s, which were really publicly characterizing Now as this very extreme organization to be ostracized. And I'm wondering how Now dealt with that sort of negative cultural characterization of itself and feminists more broadly as a group.
Well, certainly the 80s were a very difficult time for all feminists after the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, who's propelled to the White House, largely by the new right. And the real energy behind the new right through the late 70s is anti-feminists and increasingly anti-LGBT activists who are rooted in, these really conservative Christian traditions. And they get their guy in Ronald Reagan, who begins to slash welfare and social spending, that the kinds of spending that overwhelmingly benefits women, especially low-income women, especially women of color, and shifts to a much more sort of military hawkish budget. But right along with that comes a lot of cultural stereotypes about now, a lot of negative characterization that these conservative women, who arguably would never have had the kind of platform that they had without a group like Now, that is carving out a new kind of archetype for women who are fearless, who are courageous, who are political, who are public. Phyllis Schlafly certainly benefited from the rise and the prominence of Now in the early 70s when she's already well known in anti-communist and conservative circles, but she reinvents herself as a different kind of activist at that point. So Now is, the 80s are an interesting time for Now because on the one hand, the many of the 80% of Americans who supported the ERA, who wanted to see Roe versus Wade protected because it was already kind of under threat at that point, saw Now as a kind of mainstream and common sense destination for their donations, if not their energies out in a protest and their support. But Now found itself playing defense a lot, even though Now raised a lot of money for political campaigns and did a lot of high profile work around abortion. Now really dives into electoral politics in the mid 80s. The officers are sort of torn between wanting to re-broaden their agenda and get back to the kind of grassroots driven multifocal feminism that was so successful for them a decade earlier. But also they see that there are these threats to feminism. There, with Reagan putting opponents of government agencies, like in charge of those agencies, like Clarence Thomas as the head of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And there are other examples like that, right? He starts to remake the judiciary with a more conservative bent. And so the leaders of Now also see that without kind of regime change in Washington, everything they'd already gained that they thought was permanent could be undone.
Right.
And so they sort of retool their ERA machine into a fundraising and lobbying machine for the Democrats in 1984. And that's a strategy that demonstrates their clout. All of the major candidates for the Democratic primary for the presidency, they come to Now, they come to the convention, they meet with the president, Judy Goldsmith. They really want Now's support. So it shows Now they have a lot of clout. Now ends up endorsing Walter Mondale. He promises he will choose a feminist running mate, and they eventually help to convince him to choose the first woman running mate on a major party ticket, and that's Geraldine Ferraro. But as soon as Ferraro joins the ticket, both she and Mondale kind of try to distance themselves from Now and say, we're moderate. We want to get those working class white guys back, those guys who voted for Reagan in 80. How do we get them back? And so Now does a lot of work for Mondale and Ferraro, all the while emphasizing the symbolism of this historic choice. And yet when Mondale loses really handily in 84, he and some of the other Democrats blame, quote unquote, special interest groups like Now for seeming to like boss him around, that he needed to appear more independent. And groups like Now had kind of become too powerful in claiming that they had made him and they had selected, they had been responsible for the Ferraro choice.
It's interesting. 40 years later, we seem to be still obsessed rabidly with these like working class white guys.
Where are they? Who are they?
I know. Right. Like all the minors are gone, 95% of them, and yet this still seems to be the focus. It really is symbolic more than anything else as a way of leveraging power against traditionally oppressed groups.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's right. But now, they had continued to struggle to get back to what they did best, in my opinion. I mean, you could point to how much bigger their budget was in the late 70s and 80s. You could point to how many millions of members they had. They were much smaller in those early 70s years. But I would really argue that when you have a grassroots network of deeply engaged members for whom membership means participation, belonging to a local chapter, paying dues to that chapter, knowing those people, knowing them well enough to trust them and take risks for them, and working on issues that you care about. That is, even if your organization is not rich, that's a more powerful force than an organization with $1 million budget, an office in Washington, being able to claim millions of members who paid a check, who sent a check to be members, but might not have any more, any other contact with the organization than that. That's maybe not the kind of force that the powers that be would take as seriously as a kind of locally rooted network of women who are diverse, but who are united in coalition and who are engaged.
Yeah, no, that's true. There's always, power in connection. I'm wondering, you mentioned a couple minutes ago about the 1980s that everything that now thought was permanent could be undone. And I'm thinking about those words in the context of the Dobbs decision and the overturning of Roe versus Wade. And I'm wondering, and certainly hindsight is 2020, whether the fact that there was not, at least as far as I'm aware, a concerted push to codify the Roe versus Wade decision on a federal level, whether that is seen as a mistake now, whether it could have been put into place, or is that another instance of failing to anticipate the kind of rabid reaction that has evolved nationally in the last few years?
Yeah, I mean, I do think they had a sense that Roe was permanent, but that Roe needed to be built on. So Roe was necessary, but not sufficient. So yeah. Roe is 73. Abortion, I was surprised to find this in the archive, that abortion was not one of the leading issues that now was really focused on in a sustained way. I mean, certainly the chapters are doing different things, but like, for example, you don't see it in the newsletters as like a leading issue as much as you might expect with our hindsight from 2023. And I think that's because there was a sense that, okay, we had Roe, but now we need more access, and it needs to be affordable, if not free. And the Hyde Amendment, which I think is 1979, which limits public funding for abortion, I mean, now is certainly fighting against that, right? They see that as an effort to chip away at the promise of Roe, right? If this is a constitutional right, it needs to be accessible. It can't just be, the freedom from having somebody mess with your right to have an abortion if you can afford it. Like, you need to actually be able to exercise that right. Yeah. But I do think there was a sense that Roe would be permanent, and that maybe it would be chipped away at here and there, but that it would never be undone. And that, I think, says a lot about how Americans thought about the Supreme Court in, at mid-century. And for those of us sort of at the center or on the left, right, I think we maybe had a sense that the Supreme Court, it might fluctuate a little bit, but in general, it was kind of moving in a certain direction. And the recent changes, I think, I mean, the women who I've interviewed for the book who were really active in the 70s are just as shocked by the changes on the court and how quickly they've undone social policy and fundamental rights. I mean, they could go much further with the relation to birth control, with other privacy rights that we all hold dear, of course, rights related to race and other protected categories. So I don't think they could have imagined, they would not have dared to imagine that we would be here. But here we are. Yeah.
And given that, I'm wondering what the vision and the focus is for now moving forward. What, as an organization, what is its approach in 2023, and especially in the wake of the Dobbs decision? But there's so many other aspects, as you indicate, that the far right is chipping away at. What is now doing?
Well, interestingly, nobody from Now wanted to talk to me about this book. I'm not sure how they felt about somebody kind of digging around under the hood with all of their archives. So, I could direct folks to Now's website to take a look. I do think you can see in recent news coverage some of the turmoil that Now has gone through in relation to younger women and women of color in the chapters and who work at the national office. And, there's kind of a generational power struggle for Now, is my sense as an outsider. But what I can say as a historian is that there's a lot to learn in this moment from Now's history. And in particular, what we can use is the